name is Olga Mack. I'm a VP of Strategy of QuantStamp. QuantStamp is a decentralized protocol for security. I also occasionally moonlight teaching in UC Berkeley Law and write commentary about legal developments and legal industry in the United States. And I will let each of the panelists to introduce themselves.
I'm Tim Draper, and I've been a venture capitalist for many, many years. And I've had an opportunity to back entrepreneurs and ride some of the great technology waves of the world, and it looks like we're on to one now.
I'm Peteris Zilgavis. I'm head of unit for digital innovation and blockchain in the Digital Single Market Directorate in DG Connect in the European Commission, and also co-chair of the FinTech Task Force, which came up with this FinTech Action Plan, which among other things also addresses crypto assets and initial coin offerings and blockchain.
So the focus of this panel is on ICOs and particularly the regulatory aspects. My colleagues often ask me to predict the future. And I many times regret not having a crystal ball. Also, trying to understand the future, given how much is going on, is a little difficult. I find it's much easier to look into the future by looking at a few quotes, which I will read today, about the recent development, because I believe that my interpretive dance about what's going to happen is as good as anybody's. My favorite is from June 14th of 2018 by William Hinman, the head of SEC Corp Fin Division, which caused a lot of excitement in social media. Was the following: based on my understanding of the present state of Ether, the Ethereum network and its decentralized structure, current offers and sales of Ether are not securities transactions. This was a positive news for many people on social media, and definitely caused a lot of excitement and articles and optimism in the United States. Just a few days before that, Jay Clayton, the chairman of the SEC, has commented, when I give you my money and you go off and make a venture, and in return for me giving you my money, you say, you know what, I'm going to give you a return, that is a security, and we regulate that. We regulate the offering of the security, and we regulate the trading of that security. So there is a different message from Mr. Clayton. And on that same day, he also said, the SEC is not going to do any violence to the traditional definition of security, which has worked well for a long time. So there's quite a few messages from SEC. They may or may not be conflicting. They may or may not be telling, and they may or may not be predictive of a future. But those are the messages we have. And so short of regulations or litigation or anything that is actually on a piece of paper in black and white, I believe my interpretation is pretty much as good as anybody else's. One more development that is recent is that President Trump has nominated, and the Senate, I believe, has confirmed Elad Rosman as a new commissioner. And most people believe that that will be a moment toward the approving of Bitcoin ETF. The future commissioner has recently testified at a Senate Banking Committee in July, where he specifically talked about blockchain offering as requiring attention. And he said, it is essential that SEC approaches these new challenges in a fair and transparent manner, provide clarity and certainty to the market and investors, and enforce the laws and regulations that hold market participants accountable. So, another quote. I usually don't quote people on stage, but I believe when it comes to United States regulators, blockchain and ICO, I believe they can speak for themselves. So that's the developments in the United States. I would like your interpretation, Peter, of European Union and where our colleagues in Europe are.
Well, we have a little bit of a different approach. I mean, I heard also informally the quote that for the US regulator, 98% of the tokens, ICOs, are securities. On our side, we have a task force going on right now at the European Securities Markets Authority with all of our member states. We have so-called multi-level governance, 28 member states, and a European level. And that is looking at exactly what the definition of security would be in this context that the tokens would fall into. But related to that, there's also already been a quite good analysis, which is on the internet, by the French Financial Markets Authority, which is in English as well as in French. And for them, about half of the tokens are not securities and are what you could call either the utility tokens or consumers tokens. So on this one side, you have the securities regulators looking and also seeing if within, how to say, the proportionality, whether there can be a different way perhaps to deal with these tokens that are securities, but in principle, they come under the securities regulation and it's important to ensure investor rights. But others, which are not seen as an investment, about half of them by some estimates, then they come right now, it's wrong to say that they're unregulated in Europe. They come under the e-commerce directive and consumer protection. So there is a way to go and ask for your rights if there is an issue. But this directive and perhaps the consumer legislation aren't necessarily exactly the correct way to enable. It's not necessarily a pro-innovation, pro-tokenization approach, because it's looking more at a consumer product or a consumer service. So where I am exactly, we're working on a European blockchain partnership of all the member states to build a services infrastructure on blockchain, but also looking at the legal issues, and among them, the initial coin offerings and their secondary markets that are utility tokens. And based on the input we're getting from the community, which is also all of you, not just in Europe, we're looking to see what the evidence base is if there needs to be a specific directive or regulation on the utility tokens. And we would do this in interest of transparency and enabling this market if such a decision is taken.
That's very exciting. So I'm just curious, Tim, from the entrepreneur-investor point of view, the amount of legal development must be overwhelming.
Yeah, imagine my confusion. The SEC has had a little bit of two thoughts. One is, boy, the internet brought us so much great technology and so much great innovation, and it was an incredible boost to our economy. And this could be the same thing or even bigger. And the other part is, but we have this charter to protect the widows. And so we don't know exactly how to handle this. We want that innovation, but we want to protect the widows. And so they've kept it sort of nebulous. And it's fun to see that the European Union is looking at this saying, hey, we've got a better way of doing it, because this is what's happening all over the world. Everywhere I go, I meet with whoever, the prime minister of this or that country, and each of them says, how do we get the ICOs to our country? How do we bring that economy to us? We want that technology. We want those people. We want this new virtual world. And how do we get it here? And so all the countries of the world are starting to look at this and say, we're in competition for this virtual part of government, and we need to figure out how we're going to operate. And the technology is such that it is transformative. It takes governments that are fiefdoms and transforms them into sort of one big global world. The geographic borders begin to fall, and at the virtual level, they need to compete for their citizenry. Well, that gives governments sort of two approaches. They have two approaches they can take. One is, we need to keep it the old way. And that's what you see in China with the President Xi, or I guess King Xi, deciding that he wants to make Bitcoin illegal and no ICOs unless he controls everything. And what happens there is the entrepreneurs in China, of which there are many, say, what? Wait, I want to do something in this new world. I want to be a part of this new technology. I want to create something great. And so they say, well, where else can I go? And then Japan sees this happening. Japan says, Bitcoin's a national currency, and here's how you do an ICO in our country. It's very simple, 4-step process. Come to Japan. That kind of competition is going to wake up China, probably, because they're going to see this big brain drain. But I'll give you one other example. Binance started in Japan. It's a big trading system, big exchange for Bitcoin, blockchain, Bitcoin and all the other ICOs. And when China came down and said, it's illegal here, they said, whoa, we got to go, we got to move. And so they moved to Singapore to start with. And then Singapore started to regulate them kind of heavily, and they looked for other places to go. They were looking at Switzerland, and they were looking at Estonia, and they were looking at other places, and they ended up in Malta. Because Malta said, here, we'll do whatever you want. And so there is this competitive force at the virtual level. I mean, you can still have your fiefdom at the physical level, where, people who live here have to do this, this, and this. But at the virtual level, like, government really has to start to compete.
I love the spectrum that you outlined, Tim. On the one hand, you have governments that highly protectionist. I think that would be the right word to use.
Dictatorships. Yeah.
Well, that's a fighting word. But sure, let's call it a dictatorship.
Well, wait a second. The guy has decided he's going to be the president for life. He's a dictator. Right?
I'm not challenging your definition of
until
dictatorship.
He's overthrown, he's a dictator.
Sure, let's go with that definition. That is definitely a standard.
But you're right. There is a spectrum from the dictator to the socialist to the free market.
That's right.
There's sort of a thing there.
Right. So there's countries that outlaw them, and there are countries that kind of can't wait to get an advantage. But I think there's a very rich middle. And Tara, I'm just very curious, from your perspective, where does EU, either individual countries or as a unit, where it falls?
I mean, right now we're not rushing in with ICO-specific legislation, and also we'll probably never have a regulation on blockchain like we don't have a regulation on transistors or on servers. I mean, we try to be technology neutral. The ICO does have aspects of it, and why we're collecting evidence and trying to be evidence-based in our approach that are different from the IPO, and especially when you're utilizing it to give people a stake, an early stake in a system, and to use a system. You gave the example of Ethereum, which started with an ICO, but now it's the way to run smart contracts, and we're also very positive about smart contracts. We're looking perhaps to enable them through a piece of legislation, if that is needed, for recognition across borders, revocability, and fairness. Right now, by some statistics, and this is if you count Switzerland as part of Europe, which it definitely is geographically and economically, if not of the European Union. Europe is ahead in the ICOs, and there is, generally a welcoming attitude you see in our FinTech Action Plan, which is us officially as the European Commission speaking, our policy communication. We say we very much want to benefit from the technological and innovation potential. We do have some worry about some of the frauds, but this is normal, just as you have frauds in use of cash and use of credit cards and everything else. We cannot forget about that. We have to protect the consumer and the investor, but this definitely doesn't mean shutting down the possibilities and looking to see how we can give better legal clarity and more momentum to use this as an early stage funding tool.
So on the one hand, you have jurisdictions that outlaw. On the other hand, you have jurisdictions that are eager to get in and be the innovators. And then you also have a middle where you have some jurisdictions watching. So from the entrepreneur investor point of view, given the menu of choices in jurisdiction, what do you do?
Well, I think it's exciting that Europe has taken such a leadership role. I mean, Europe tended to be slow in the technological world before, but I noticed that, for instance, London, if you still consider that part of Europe.
Until March, at least.
For the moment.
London has been very aggressive in allowing crowdfunding. And Switzerland had a huge lead on in ICOs until they started to heavily regulate, and then it got a little bit heavy, and people went to other countries. And then Malta seems to be taking a lead, and I guess Estonia is also European, right? So Estonia was the first country to think in terms of having a governance that's sort of land-based, but then having this virtual level of governance where, in fact, the Estonian prime minister came to Draper University, to the school I started for entrepreneurs, and he said, first he said, just by instituting digital signatures, we saved 2% of our GDP. And then he said, and when we did digital voting, the young people started to vote. And when we did digital identity, the crime rate went down. And then he hands me a card, and he said, you are now the third virtual resident of Estonia. So he started to think in terms, he says, you don't have to, I've been to Estonia, but he said, you don't have to set foot in Estonia to set up a European bank account, to buy European real estate. You are now an Estonian virtual resident.
I think he was pitching you.
Yeah, you bet. But he was also a visionary, because what I've noticed is now there's sort of two levels of government. There's the part that's land-based. It's like, you know, where are you going to put your buildings, and how are you going to affect your neighbors? And how do we live in this part of this territory? Do we have too much water, or do we have not enough? You know, that kind of thing. And then there's this virtual part of governance, which turns out to be a huge part of it, which is we provide you your medical insurance and your pension, Social Security, your how we handle welfare, how we handle a census, how we manage driver's licenses and whatever else. That can all be done virtually.
You mean
voting.
No more DMV? I'm not sure my life will be complete without standing in line.
Voting can be much more virtual too. And so we are now, no more DMV. Oh my gosh, I heard 4 hours. My daughter got a lesson in governance, and she finally said, Dad, you're right. We need to deregulate. Anyway, I encourage you to deregulate, but I also like the fact that you're going to take a special attention to the ICO and make it a systemic. Are you going to, if you do it through the EU, does it go to every country, or do they kind of then get to vote to see whether they want to do it?
And more
Well, the adoption takes place. I mean, we as the Commission propose a piece of legislation. The member states, along with the European Parliament, adopt it, but then it applies, and it can apply with passporting throughout the EU. And I would say we're not perhaps on a deregulation agenda, but we're very definitely on a regulatory sandbox, on a regulatory experimentation agenda.
And just out of my curiosity, given that Tim went into government defined by the boundaries, by physical boundaries versus other ways to govern, I would love to be a fly on the wall when the governments discuss the reality of governments not being bound by jurisdictional boundaries.
Well, we have to think about this now. I mean, at least a part of the economy is very much moving to the intangible economy and to the decentralized economy. And it's not just ICOs and blockchain, it's artificial intelligence, it's big data, it's the Internet of Things, it's the convergence between these things. I mean, we'll still have great food in California or France, and you have to live somewhere, and you like to live in a nice place with a view of the sea or architecture in the city. But the part of the economy of ideas and the economy of technology is going to be more and more decentralized, crossing borders, and require international coordination with those countries that are ready to coordinate and ready to not stop things and look for ways to go forward, though we stay with investor protection and consumer protection ideas.
So I put into the heads of both the Prime Minister of Malta and the Prime Minister of Kazakhstan, I said to the Prime Minister of Malta, I said, so there could be 1 billion Maltese. And his eyes lit up. Same thing, I said, there could be 1 billion Kazakhs. And his eyes lit up. By the way, Kazakhstan means free, freedom, free land.
Well, nothing like that. And also, I believe music to their ears to small nations. Billion inhabitants on a very small plot of land. The possibility of collecting taxes must be exciting.
Absolutely. And what that means is that they have to compete. So they would collect taxes. If they competed well, you might say, hey, I'm going to have my Social Security done out of Chile, but I'm going to have my medical insurance done out of Canada, and then there is the possibility that you would get your pension or some other part of your government service out of a country that does not even have a land base.
So it turns out Tim is very good at pitching this. I can't wait for you to graduate from Malta and Kazakhstan to, say, Brazil and, at some point, United States. That is the future that I'm looking forward to. My question to the panelists, just to keep us on time, what are you looking for in the future of these decentralized economies? What makes you get up in the morning and still want to see how it unfolds?
Well, I mean, I think it is really exciting that you have a convergence between these decentralized technologies. The data coming from the Internet of Things, the blockchain can manage it, sending it to artificial intelligence for analysis, send it back either to your doctor, your hospital, your stockbroker, as you've directed it to do through smart contracts. There's a role of interaction between smart government using perhaps a regulatory sandbox, a regulatory experimentation process to make sure that this is not a way to commit fraud or, push people out into vulnerable situations. But I think this is very exciting. There's a lot of opportunity for technology. It's a lot of opportunity to give more power into the hand of the individual consumer and citizen. And I think there's some exciting things happening. And raising money by initial coin offerings, for instance, either for utility tokens or in the securities context, is an exciting part of it.
I totally agree. As a venture capitalist, we are always looking for new technologies that can provide complete windfall changes in very large industries. And the industries that could potentially be changed here are immense. They are not just where the internet changed communications and information journalism, games, entertainment, a lot of different things. The Bitcoin and all the technologies associated with Bitcoin, whether it be blockchain or smart contracts or any of those, or even attaching it to big data and deep learning, these industries are in the trillions of dollars. These are finance and banking and insurance and real estate and government itself. If it becomes virtualized, it could end up being the biggest industry in the world. The one that's really fun to think about is healthcare. Imagine you control all your data on the blockchain. It's your health records, and it's your blood tests, and your genetic history, and it all goes up into the cloud. But it's not just those, it's your Fitbit results, and where you live, and what you've eaten for breakfast, and where you've traveled, and how much airtime you've had, and all of these things put together. And then suddenly the cloud becomes a better doctor than any doctor could be, given 12 years of memorizing as much as they possibly could, because it would be specific to you. One example might be, you've got a headache and I've got a headache. The doctor tells us both, take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning. The cloud says, well, you take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning, but me? I've recently been to Fire Island, and there are ticks there, and it's likely you have Lyme tick, and you should be taking antibiotics. So each thing could be a very different item, and more and more data about ourselves is going to go up into the cloud. My guess is that we will control it, and I think healthcare is going to change just full bore. Oh, one other thing. I'm sorry, I'm running out of. We're all out of time, but
don't apologize to me. Apologize to the organizer. I enjoy listening to you.
I apologize to the audience. My dream is for me to raise money in Bitcoin, fund companies in Bitcoin, and have them pay their employees and their suppliers in Bitcoin, and that would require 0 accounting fees.
Well, on that big dream, I would love to welcome you to thank this amazing panelists, and let's have a round of applause. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you.
I like that handshake. She's got a great handshake. Nice meeting you.